Welcome to the Sports Science Dudes. I am your host, Dr. Jose Antonio, with my co-host, Dr. Anthony Ricci. If this is your first time listening, hit the like button and subscribe to the show. We'll cover all things related to sports science and nutrition. If you want to email us with any suggestions for guests or topics, our email is sportsciencedudes@gmail.com. That is sportsciencedudes@gmail.com. Our guest today is Dr. Guillermo Escalante. Dr. Escalante is currently an assistant dean, so he wants the money, and professor of kinesiology for the College of Natural Sciences at Cal State University, San Bernardino. He's taught various courses, and he's got quite an extensive CV, so we'll just kind of summarize it a little. He's taught many courses in exercise science and kinesiology, such as sports nutrition, prevention and care of athletic injuries, principles of strength and conditioning, principles of human movement, exercise prescription, health and fitness, business management, and more. So really quite a varied background. He also serves as a consultant to several businesses in the areas of fitness, sports medicine, exercise, and sports nutrition. His degrees include a Doctor of Science in Athletic Training with an MBA, which is really kind of cool because I always thought I should get an MBA. But anyhow, with an MBA with concentrations in marketing and healthcare management, a BS in athletic training with a bio minor. He's also a certified athletic trainer, strength and conditioning specialist, and sports nutritionist. So the dude knows some stuff. In fact,
yeah, he does.
He's a sports science dude. So welcome to the show. Welcome to the show, Guillermo.
Well, thank you, Dr. Antonio, Dr. Ricci, for having me. You know, I've known you guys for years through the ISSN, of course, and I'm glad that you guys have this awesome podcast together and bringing some evidence-based science dudes like we all are, to bring the science out and just let people know more good quality information.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, we're excited about the show, and in fact, I want to start with. There's a lot of fun stuff to talk about because you have an interesting background, not just academically, but you compete in bodybuilding. So let's put that aside for a little bit, and talk about a more serious subject about why. And I actually have a good friend here in South Florida, Will Brink. We've talked about why do bodybuilders seem to be dying at a young age, and not just at a young age, but it seems to be quite frequent. It's almost as if we're not even surprised anymore. It's like, wow, this is really strange. I'm sure there's a myriad of factors, and you have a recently published paper. So if you could, talk a little bit about that and tell the audience what you think is going on.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, it's bodybuilding is obviously very dear to my heart, and I've worked in many capacities in the bodybuilding circuit. And yeah, this is something that, I've obviously seen it over the years. And, after so many years being in the industry, in different capacities, I just got tired of hearing people say, it's like, rest in peace, bro, rest in peace, bro. And that's what everybody says, like, oh, so-and-so died, rest in peace, bro. And I'm seeing these guys, and, some of them are dying in their 20s, 30s, 40s. I mean, it's incredible. And I always say, and I work with Rick Collins, as you guys know, and, association does not mean causation, but at the same time, we always have to see if there's a smoking gun, we should do some investigation. And that's kind of what I see. I see a lot of these things occurring, and obviously there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes. And of course, there are hereditary factors, there are nutritional factors, they're carrying a lot of body weight. So there's a lot of different covariates that are going to potentially contribute to some of this. But nonetheless, there's an elephant in the room, and I think we have to address it. So most recently, what we did is we actually looked at the autopsy reports of bodybuilders that died before the age of 50. So we actually just did between 2018, 19, 20, there was just a lot of more deaths, like you said. Like every time you turn around, there was another bodybuilder that was dying, both men and women. We actually focus our sample on men. And we just did a general Google search, like dead bodybuilders, and then we basically had a list, and from that list we basically were able to narrow down. We found people that died of all different causes. Then we narrowed it down to how many died of cardio. We wanted to focus on the heart because that seems to be the one that is most prevalent. So we were looking at cardiovascular related deaths in bodybuilding, and then we wanted to focus it for the wow factor for guys in their 50, because it's not very typical for a man to die before the age of 50. It's just not in all athletics. As we started narrowing down the search, of course, there were people that potentially that had died that weren't in the country, so we can't get those autopsy reports very easily. We finally narrowed down the list. We were able to actually get our hands on 6 autopsy reports. We actually had 14 deaths that were cardiovascular related events, but when we tried to get those autopsy reports, some of them were not available and they were inaccessible. So we actually were able to analyze 6 of them, and we saw some pretty amazing trends. Well, the first amazing trend was the average age of these guys was 36 years old. So I mean, these are not old men, and I mean the youngest one was, I believe, 26 years old. So another one was 30. And then we have a few in the 40s, kind of bringing that average up. So we see some very young guys that are passing away. And then of course we were able to see the autopsy reports. Now I will say one cool thing that we found here was that the autopsy reports, there's actually a limitation in how the autopsy reports are done, because they're kind of all over the place. Some were very well done, very thorough toxicology reports, et cetera. So you could see a lot more. Some of them were done very vaguely. And that we actually pointed to a paper there that actually identifies what should a coroner do when they find an individual who is potentially a bodybuilder, potentially has signs of abusing superphysiological doses of anabolic steroids, so that they can go a little further, so we can learn a little bit more. So that aside, what we found was the average, the weight of the heart was about 575 grams. When compared to the reference man, it's 332 grams. So we have about a 74% difference in how much just the heart weighs.
Well over a pound then too, right? Yeah.
Exactly. Next, we have the left ventricular myocardium, which was at an average of, and this is the thickness of that, was about 16.3 millimeters compared to about 13 millimeters. So 125% bigger than the average individual. 100% of them had left ventricular hypertrophy. 80% of them had atherosclerosis, and some had different degrees of stenosis in some of the major coronary arteries there. And then the causes of death were kind of varied from steroid-induced cardiomyopathy to sudden cardiac dysrhythmia. We had left ventricular hypertrophy. We had hypertensive and arteriosclerotic heart disease, dyslipidemia. There was a history of dyslipidemia in some of these guys as well. And again, the stenosis of the major arteries. So, of course, one of the limitations we have of this study is, we compared it to the reference man. Obviously, we do know that there is cardiac hypertrophy that occurs in other strength trained athletes that are natural. But at the same time, yes, we do, but they're not dying either. Right. So we really have to compare that. And there was actually a recent study that I just read that's actually looking at that, the natural versus enhanced bodybuilders in, the left ventricle thickness. And we're actually seeing some other signs. For example, ejection fraction is lower in the people that are using the superphysiological doses. So we actually see some other, I'm going to say, external variables that are different. So besides the left ventricle being bigger in both of them, it's still significantly bigger in those that are enhanced compared to those that are not. And we also see other, again, covariates that could potentially contribute more. So again, you add that to people that have the genetic predisposition to that, and then now they're abusing these things, and then now you're gonna, instead of dying at age maybe 55 or 65 or 75, they're dying much younger.
Yeah, well, the number you presented earlier, I don't remember what it was, but it was the weight of the heart. I think you would compare. What was the weight you said? And you compared it to the reference man? Right?
575 grams versus 332 grams.
Okay, my question is this. So androgen use obviously is one of the confounders here, or maybe a contributing factor. Is there any data at all, while you're sort of culling through the literature, of endurance athletes who also use androgens? And obviously they have left ventricular hypertrophy, but they also don't tend to die young. So there's this confluence of, well, their exercise is different. They're not trying to get bigger, but they do use androgens because it helps with recovery. Is there anything like that at all in the literature?
I don't think they've investigated that as much to my knowledge, but we definitely do see that. But we do see a difference in the type of hypertrophy that occurs. And I'm not a cardiologist, but I've read the term concentric and eccentric type of hypertrophy, which is so it's different in resistance trained athletes as it is in the endurance based athletes. And one actually has more pathology than the other. The concentric type actually has the most pathology, if I'm not mistaken. So yeah, it's very interesting when we actually see some of these things out there. And you're right. I mean, you do see endurance athletes that are using androgens, maybe even growth hormone. But at the same time, we don't see them, dying at average age of 36 years old.
Right.
I one thought on that too, though. I would assume that super physiological dosages might be a disadvantage as well, because it may promote, in the endurance athlete, that is, forgive me, that may promote degrees of hypertrophy, even independent of the training style, that might not be advantageous or lead to a weight retention that would probably inhibit endurance performance. So perhaps they keep those levels down. I don't know, Guillermo, maybe you have a thought on that. Or
yeah, and I think if we look at if we were to measure the dose, I mean, I think there's a lot of different athletes that are using, these anabolics in different degrees. But of course, in the world of bodybuilding, I mean, when we talk super physiological, we're talking extreme super physiological, where, I mean, some of the guys at the Olympia level, are using, upwards of 1.5 to 3 grams a week of these androgens, compared to, in the medical literature, 600 milligrams a week is, probably 5 or 6 times what you would give a prescribed medically to a patient. Okay. So, 200 milligrams a week is very high, extremely high and that's probably the high end dosage that a doctor would prescribe to someone who's got hypogonadism. So to take 3 times that amount is still super physiological, but for a bodybuilder, they would consider that I'm just on low test right now.
Almost clean, I would assume.
Yeah. They actually call that, someone would call that, I'm on TRT now. I'm like, no, that's not TRT. I'm sorry to tell you.
Well, let's sort of go on the other side of, because I think you were referencing Bassin study in 1996, or Bassin, I forget how you pronounce his name. So in 1996, the landmark study, it was 600 mgs of testananthate weekly. And this is what I found most fascinating about that study. I think the treatment duration was 10 weeks. I don't know if you recall. Was it 10 weeks?
I think so, yes.
Yeah, they found, okay, so they got bigger, like triceps got bigger, quads got bigger. They had biopsy data, but they had no side effects. There was no mood changes. There was no roid rage. And to me, that was the single randomized controlled trial that it sort of put a nail in a coffin on the idea of roid rage, because obviously with any kind of drug, you're going to there's a dose dependent effect. I did my postdoc actually with a gentleman who did most of his work on androgen receptor regulation. And he felt that it's not so much the androgen that gives you any angry behavior. It's basically, if you're a jackass to begin with, it might exacerbate you being just a bigger jackass if you're taking high dose androgen. So I'm sure you've gotten this question before. Is there a way to take androgens or some sort of anabolic steroid, or, depending on the type, whether it's enanthate or test SIP or whatever, at a certain dose for a certain duration, and get bigger, faster, stronger, or whatever the metric is that you want to use for that performance athlete, with no side effects?
Yeah, I think there's definitely an amount there that's kind of a quote unquote sweet spot where you can gain some good benefit without necessarily getting huge deleterious side effects. But I think you hit it on the nose. It's dose dependent, and it's also time dependent. So how long are you being exposed to this? So even if you're exposed at 600 milligrams a week for 10 weeks, okay, in this study it showed maybe no deleterious side effects. But what happens at 20 weeks or 30 weeks? Right. And then I see now we may see this crossover. Alternatively, maybe you could use 300 milligrams a week instead of for 10 weeks. Maybe you can use it for 20 or 30. And that's what I see now. There are some, they're quote unquote evidence-based practitioners that are out there that are prescribing some of this. Of course, they're not necessarily medical doctors, but they actually, to their credit, they read the medical literature, and they actually do understand it quite a bit, and they present it. Not everybody, but there's a handful of them that I actually read. I'm like, wow, they're presenting some good data, and they're really kind of, I mean, they're reading studies in German, and they're digging deep into some of the literature, and you know, and they actually say, it's like, hey, I'm not a doctor, I'm not even a PhD, you know, I'm somebody, you know, I have a college degree, and I know how to read science, and they can critically analyze the studies.
But, you know, what's interesting, I have a question actually for Tony, but some of the people who have known the most about androgen use are actually just bodybuilders who have no background. And it's purely on trial and error, because you and I know those studies will not be done on, there's no IRB approval for super high dose androgen use.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly right. Yeah, so some of these newer models that are safer model use, I mean, that's kind of what instead of going on this blast cruise, you know, they're actually saying, it's like, hey, you know, bring up the RPMs a little bit, you know, but don't redline it so much in terms of, so you can take a decent amount that's still going to give you a good amount of benefit, maybe take it for a longer period of time, instead of going on an 8 or 10 or 12-week blast. And check your health biomarkers, right? Check your blood pressure, check your hematocrit levels, check your HDLs, check your LDLs, you know, look at all of these different biomarkers and see what's going on internally. And if you can keep those biomarkers in a healthy range, and you can still cruise and get some benefit that way, you know, there is kind of that potential sweet spot. And with some of these, even the type that you're using, right? So you can maybe use a true testosterone, like you were talking about, a propionate, cypionate, and anthate. There's going to be some inter-individual variability before you're going to maybe get some side effects there. Some may have side effects at 200 milligrams, some at 4, some at 5. And then you can maybe add another, you know, type of androgen, you know, whether it's a DHT derivative or one of these other derivatives, and get similar results in just using different things.
I actually want to ask you, Tony, about, because we know performance enhancing drug use is prevalent in bodybuilding, but it's actually it's more prevalent in cycling, believe it or not, but neither one of us are cyclists. So I wanted to ask what your thoughts were on the prevalence of it in the fight sports, because if there's a sport that requires recovery, not just recovery from, you know, training, but recovery from actual traumatic damage from fighting. Now, we have data, well, sort of data. USADA, before USADA came in, you saw a certain group of fighters. Now USADA is, you know, obviously drug testing is a big part of MMA, and I'm not sure about boxing. You would know that better. How prevalent do you think it is in the fight sports?
I do think that MMA, well, the UFC has done a pretty good job at regulating it. Now, some will diminishing the use, if not the use, the dosage, if not the dosage, the type of drugs. Those I would assume, and Dr. Guillermo would know better than I, those with a shorter half-life, right? Because they do get tested. I've been in the gym over and over again where USADA just arbitrarily shows up, or they'll wait in the gym for the athlete. The efficacy of the testing, that could be argued, and I'm not an expert on that side. Currently, though, I think that the use, as stated in MMA through the UFC, is certainly diminished. If not diminished, you could argue the athlete would have to be such an expert in beating the test that I don't know how much benefit they would be getting over time. Now, when you run those shows in different countries, as an example, where the athletes are native to that nation, the testing becomes a little bit harder to regulate. But as far as the UFC, I think they've done a relatively decent job at bringing the drug use down. Some would argue just let them do it. I have my reservations when somebody is being punched squarely in the face about drug use and augmenting performance significantly more than it would be without the drug. Boxing, is a little bit more of the Wild West on that. And you'll take an athlete like a Chris Algieri, who's a WBO world champion, and I know, and I'm quite confident, has never used the drugs, and I'm also quite confident has competed against many in his weight class that have. the testing regulations or the testing criteria in boxing are almost non-existent. Occasionally, you see somebody get pulled for EPO. I don't know why that is versus an anabolic or androgen. But nevertheless, boxing has a little bit more of an open game in that. And also you have to take a look at boxing too. The body types differ significantly. So my point to that is how drugs could actually maybe to some athletes have a negative impact depending upon body structure. Adding 10, 15 pounds is not going to do anything for your tank. So in that regard, it might be negative. The boxers a little bit more of that leaner, taller body, lighter lower extremity. If they're not, they're going to be too short for their weight class. They may have the ability to put some size on, and some strength and power from it without inducing too much hypertrophy. But last but not least, not to take too much of our time, I think we all know the ADCC, okay, Abu Dhabi Combat Club. It's pretty open that, I'll probably get in trouble for this one, but you're almost penalized if you don't do it. So, and all the athletes will come straight out and tell you, yeah, I do it. So let's go with the playing field, regulating. Right? Boxing being wide open and ADCC being quite, it being quite prominent in those three.
Awesome. Changing tacks a little bit, and then I'm going to get to some of the questions that we sent to you, Guillermo. This is more of an evolutionary question, and it has to do with longevity and the fact that it's sort of dovetailing with bodybuilders dying young, but in general, large people don't live long, even if it's muscle. So we know that if you're obese, lifespan is incredibly shortened. But also, you don't see old basketball players. I mean, we're not just talking about like muscular big height.
Right.
So, and you love the sport of bodybuilding. Is bodybuilding in the long run deleterious to longevity if the goal is always to put on mass, and mass?
Well, I think it can potentially be, depending on how you go about it. I mean, one of the trends that I've seen in bodybuilding over the last couple of decades is people, even including myself, people are competing a lot longer. I'm going to be 47 this year. I started competing when I was 23. So, I mean, most people if they started at 23, by the time they're 35, they're retired, right? Or maybe they started at 16, 17, by the time they're 30, 35, they're retired. But I see a trend in people going longer for longer periods of time. And I have no scientific data on this, but I hypothesize that, again, that the exposure, what we were talking about, right? Dosage and length of exposure, so now it's like your body can handle being beat up maybe for 10, 12, 15 years. It's pretty resilient. But now if you continue to push that envelope for years on end, and you have a genetic predisposition, and now you're continually getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, I think collectively, it may have an impact, and over time.
And certainly for you, Tony, since you undergo hypertrophy, if you just look at a pink dumbbell, whereas me, I'd have to lift like 5,000 pink dumbbells. So Tony's one of the few guys who's like, no, I don't need to lift more.
I do everything I can to take muscle off. Guillermo, maybe you can help me, and it ain't going anywhere. I'm trying to get rid of some of it.
No, that's awesome. I wish I had that problem. You're one of those guys that walks into the gym, smells the way, says, okay, I'm done.
It just goes, but you look like you're putting it on pretty good yourself, my friend. And also, I got to say one thing complimentary to, you look young and healthy. So to Dr. Antonio's point, thus far, it doesn't, with the tension you've put on your body, the stress through training, you come across as an individual that is very healthy. Where I've seen people 10 years younger than you in the sport, I don't think it's been so kind. I think they look a little more stressed, weathered, and banged up from it. But you have the young glowing skin and look young and healthy. So I think, like you said, it's multifactorial as to what would contribute to, expediting entropy, if you will, right?
Thanks for the compliment. No, I appreciate that. But I do attribute that. I mean, partly to genetics. My mom is 70 something. She looks amazingly young.
There you go.
So we have that oily skin that helps.
That's right.
I
think the three of us are qualified.
Right? I will say that I've always been very good at looking under the hood, checking with my physician on a regular basis, and making sure that other things are going. And even if things kind of go off whack for a little bit, making sure that they kind of get back on track. And so I'm a big advocate of that to make sure you do that. And even though I'd say I'm probably bigger than the average individual, I'm also not I'm 5'5", 5'6", 5'6" with shoes on, I like to say. So I'm about 190, 195 in my off season. I think the heaviest I've been is maybe 230, but that was pretty chubby. But I've never really gotten to that extreme where some guys my height are, off seasoning it at the big time pros. They're off seasoning it at 220, 230. And they're competing at 210, 205 at my height.
They're competing at that.
Yeah, I mean it's a lot. So that extra 20, 30 pounds of mass is a big difference.
Yeah, that's a lot of mass. Let's transition to a much more fun topic, and it's one that you're probably asked quite a bit. Trained individuals gaining muscle and losing fat simultaneously. I even get this question, and the way I approach it, and tell me if this is how you do it or you do it different, is I tell them to prioritize one or the other and work on that first. However, you can do both. So what say you?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I agree 100%. I said, just because you can doesn't mean you should, because you're going to get most benefit from doing one or the other, right? Trying to gain the muscle mass or losing the body fat. Of course, of importance when trying to lose the body fat is try to maintain as much muscle as you can. That being said, I do highlight, who are you that you're talking to, right? Because it varies so much in the response. So, if you have this obese individual who's sedentary, who's, eating 2 meals a day, not eating enough protein, hasn't exercised since they were 15 years old, that individual, you get protein intake up to just 1.6 grams per kilo, get them moving. Even an aerobic exercise program will put muscle mass on that individual,
right.
In some instances, right? So you put the weight training on top of that, and then it's going to improve. So I think it really kind of depends, training status, training age. I think whether you're male or female, obviously, your endogenous state, what your hormones are producing. I think all of those things are going to definitely play an impact. And then I think the more things that you're doing right, the harder it is going to be to do both, right? So if you're already fairly lean, if you've been training for 10, 15 years and you're 10% body fat, and you've been weight training 4 or 5 days a week, and you've been eating enough, so you've been checking all the boxes for years and years, chances of you body recomping are going to be, very minimal, right? And that's when it's most important to really prioritize. But when you're checking a lot of boxes wrong, and you haven't been doing a lot of these basic things that we know are important, and you incorporate them, then I think it's a very viable situation for them. And that being said, I think I kind of take advantage of that. So even if they are trying to, let's say, lose body fat primarily, the nice thing about that, if they're doing a lot of things wrong, I can just start them, if they've been sedentary, start them exercising, get their protein intake up, increase fruit and vegetable intake. All of a sudden I can actually get more water in them, all those things, get more rest. Now we add all of those things. I don't even have to put them in a deficit, and all of a sudden they lose body fat and gain muscle because they were doing so many things wrong. So that's how I approach it.
And Tony, like with the fight sports, obviously, if you're in a weight class, the last thing you want to do is actually gain lean body mass, unless you're in the heavyweight class. So for them, it's almost always maintaining a lean physique and or losing fat. Much different than the old days. If you go back to the 70s and 80s, watching old time fighters, a lot of them would just get fat between fights. I remember Roberto Duran, he would just get fat. Even Muhammad Ali would be like kind of chubby and out of shape between fights. But now, obviously nutrition is better. So, comment on how modern fighters now approach the body comp issue, because most of them don't think about gaining lean mass per se, but they don't obviously want to lose it.
No, they don't. And to be honest, the preservation of it, when you look at the 10 to 12 weeks, gaining would be challenging, right? Because of the sheer training volumes, the multitude of biomotor stimulus. So, it's not like you're just strength training. Yeah, you're doing strength training, but then you're almost punching some of that muscle off with the sheer volume in striking on a heavy bag, for example, for 500, 600, 7 times. But conversely, then the grappling is something genetically dependent where some people put that muscle back. So I think first, regarding the lean tissue preservation or size, it's contingent upon the body type. So if you take a Volkanovski, for example, who fights featherweight and shorter than most opponents, he may still be more inclined to either hold that lean tissue or even add a little, depending upon the training stimulus, the sleep, and the diet, and so forth. Whereas somebody that might fight at 145 who's 6'1", obviously their body might have a greater propensity to rid that tissue. Right. So I think the preservation or the actual gaining is very genetically dependent, more than even the stimulus. However, to your point, one of the good things is that they are doing a better job right now, if you will, of staying within a reasonable range of their weight class. And I think they're progressing to stay at that 10% or under. We just did that paper, Dr. A, as you know, we were very surprised by this, Guillermo, that most of the best athletes are significantly lower in body weight prior to the 72 hours, 48 hours, and 24 hours to weight to the scale than we thought previously. And even some of those, we have much less data on this from the UFC, but some of those in the off season are staying within that 10% above body weight and below. So I think the sport has evolved, to Dr. Antonio's point, significantly, where they're kind of cognizant now of the fact they don't want to put themselves through hell and back, and they're reasonable about how much weight they're gaining in between. And once again, though, it's very, to your point, but very body type specific too.
No, it's great that you guys are doing some of that stuff, because I mean, that's one thing for wrestlers and UFC fighters, boxers, that I see all the time. They're the old school method of losing 8-10% of their body weight in a 24 to 48 hour period, and it's like it never made sense. So it's like, now stay within what what we call striking distance of your weight. So if you're gonna weigh in at 170, so stay within 175, 176. If you need to lose 2 or 3% of your body weight, overnight, that's doable without having deleterious effects on your performance. But if you have to lose 5 or 10% of your body weight, you're going to have some performance detriments potentially, I would imagine.
And that's spot on, particularly where the maintenance of weight is sustained, like the wrestling season. You might be able to get away with a little bit more if you're doing 3-4 cuts per year, and you have a 36-hour rehydration window like you do in professional fighting. But to your point, in collegiate wrestling, we got to keep those percentages much more right in the window of the 2 to 3%, as you know.
Absolutely.
Now, staying on the body composition issue, I want you to comment, Guillermo, on fasted versus non-fasted aerobic exercise, and then also when bodybuilders go through their diet refeeds and diet breaks, what's the physiology behind that? Because obviously it's a big part of bodybuilding training.
Yeah, absolutely. So so fasted versus fed cardio, that's one that the debate's been around, and I still hear it all the time. You still see a lot of trainers and fitfluencers recommend it, and to me, I was one that at first I was like, it doesn't work at all, and you see some of the evidence, and then I started to kind of like look at the caveats behind. And then it became kind of it might depend. And I still think there's a lot we don't know. I would say for probably 90% of the population, it really doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, it's just, caloric expenditure, versus intake over the course of the day, the week, the month, et cetera, to be able to do that. So, whether you're metabolizing fat or metabolizing carbs acutely is kind of irrelevant as to whether you're burning body fat at the end of the day. That being said, though, I think there's really, when we actually wrote a paper on this, and we looked at a narrative review, and we looked at the literature, a lot of acute studies, but okay, so we have some mechanistic potential things there, but then we started kind of looking at, let's look at some of the chronic studies, the training studies, and really there's only 5 that have been done, and actually of those, really only 1 has been done similarly to what would be prescribed in kind of a real life scenario. And that was done by Brad Schoenfeld and Alan Aragon, I think back in 2014. And if you look at that study, I think they were looking at, I can't believe it was females. I want to say they were track and field athletes, maybe basketball players, one or the other. I can't recall right off the top of my head. But anyway, they actually had they were actually dieting. So they were in a hypocaloric diet. So they were the only study that actually, they measured body composition pre and post. Caveat there, they measure body composition with the bod pod. So we have to look at, what's the measurement error of that bod pod, and the smallest detectable difference between those. So we have to put that in the back of our head. But they actually found that the group that did the fasted cardio did lose like a little bit more body fat, not statistically significant. It wasn't enough to reach statistical significance, and it might have been that measurement error of the bod pod. But what I always say is it was only done for 4 weeks. They were, however, on a hypocaloric diet, and they weren't resistance training. So when I put it at my bodybuilding goggles on, and I say, okay, well, how do bodybuilders apply it? So we apply it typically, it's not 3 days a week. We typically apply it 5 to 7 days a week at some points, right? We don't do it for just 4 weeks. They typically do it for probably 8, 10, 12, maybe 20 weeks. Wow. So, when you kind of look at all of those different assets, you don't just do cardio, you're doing resistance training in addition to. Protein intake was adequate in their study. It's also adequate in the bodybuilders, of course. You may use performance enhancement drugs in the bodybuilding circuit, which might be deleterious to a natural competitor because they might be able to preserve some muscle. So there's a lot of competing, I'm going to say covariates again, that may contribute to some of this. So what I look at is, for the general population, it probably doesn't matter. For bodybuilders, I think I wouldn't say it doesn't work completely. I would say it may not be, it's not better, but it's certainly not detrimental for the most part, unless you're maybe a natural bodybuilder. Then it may be because you're on a caloric deficit. When we look at you put that number over time, the difference between 1st and 5th in a bodybuilding show could be having an extra 3 pounds less body fat, right? Yeah. And being able to do that. So what modalities can we do to do that? So I think there's more that could be investigated there for that particular population only. I would say for the majority of the people, probably doesn't matter. And the other thing that was very interesting in that literature is there was an acute study with that Chad Kirksick did with his group. And they actually looked at what I term protein enhanced cardio. So it's not fasted. It's just, let's feed people protein about 30 minutes to an hour before you do that aerobic activity. They gave them whey protein, casein protein, and they look at oxidation rates. And obviously it's got a thermic effect of food, so it's going to naturally increase your metabolism, but they actually oxidize a little more fat in that state. They haven't done a training study on that, but that would be another potential hypothesis. And that may be another, I'm going to say, strategy that could be used by natural bodybuilders to potentially preserve lean body mass and provide the body with the amino acids while doing the aerobic activity.
It could be positive for anybody in Gen Pop trying to lose a little fat and sustain that lean tissue too, right? I mean,
absolutely,
a very nice approach. Yeah,
absolutely. And the nice thing about it is, I always say, there's also the non-physiological parts of why you may want to benefit, because again, there's no potential detriment, right? Particularly if you're doing the protein component. But to me, it's like, if I know that I can just get up in the morning, most people prefer to lift, they don't necessarily like cardio. So if you're going to skimp on anything in your workouts, it's probably going to be your cardio. So if you just can get up in the morning, first thing, get that done, now you're able to kind of, change up your training. Now your training can be kind of focused. I'm going to do my cardio in the morning, and then I'm going to eat a few meals, fuel my body. And then when I really need to focus hard on my lifting, I'm actually going to actually train, 6 or 8 hours later. Now, again, there's probably some conflicting evidence, or that there's an interference effect or some of this. If you're doing low intensity, probably not. But again, if I'm a bodybuilder and I'm trying to preserve every ounce of lean body mass, why not preserve that muscle mass and spread out my cardio for my resistance training session as much as possible. Awesome. So those are kind of the non-physiological reasons why you may do it. And you don't have to be in the gym as long. You kind of focus on one thing.
Love that.
Yeah, and also there are endurance athletes that train fasted because you can't really eat anything before you go run, bike, or swim. I mean, imagine consuming something before you go swimming, you'll like throw up in the pool. So sort of by default, it has to be fasted. And I think another thing is in the endurance world, and this is a short sidebar, but teaching yourself to train in a fasted state has its value as well, because you don't always have food with you. I mean, particularly in sports like running, it's not like you're carrying food. So cycling is different because you could carry food with you. There's other sports. Swimming, you obviously can't carry food. So I think there's a role there, and it's a waste of time to do fasted cardio. I think sort of misses the forest for the trees, because as you said, if you're doing this 5 days a week versus in that study, I think you said it was 3 days a week in that study. Yeah, I mean, that's completely different. And also, if you're doing it long term, that's different than doing it 4 weeks. So I think I think it's important for us to state that. Now, going back to, so now you've competed in a show, and now you have to go through this refeed. There's not much data on this. A lot of it is trial and error. Could you explain the physiology between getting that diet refeed or reverse dieting or whatever the nomenclature is, because it seems to be all over the place.
Yeah, and I think the concept was there. To kind of backtrack one small step before that is, there's definitely a body fat overshoot that is waiting to happen if especially if you've done your diet intensity. I mean, traditionally bodybuilders used to diet, as you guys know, for just 12 weeks. That was how long you prep for your show? 12 weeks. And then and that was just like the cookie cutter, like you need to diet for just 12 weeks. And it's like, and then all of a sudden they realize, well, what did we diet for like 15 or 20 or 24, right? And now we actually see, well, there's some potential benefit to maybe dieting, 20 to 24 weeks to prepare for a competition. And that's the downside is it's a long time, right? But the upside is you maybe don't have to suffer as much, because if you have to lose 24 pounds, 30 pounds of body fat in 12 weeks, can you do it? Yeah. You're going to be pretty miserable though, but now you spread that out over 24 weeks, you're going to still be miserable for a little longer, but you don't have to create as much deficit to go into it, right? So maybe your training volume can be a little bit lower, your caloric deficit can be a little bit lower, can be adjusted a little bit differently. And that being said, I mean, we do have data, as you guys know, that the faster we lose it, then your fat overshoot is going to be potentially higher, and we do see some of that. So if why a lot of that has to do, because you're going to be losing a lot of, as you're losing it faster, you're probably not going to preserve as much lean body mass, so that's going to be a contributing factor to that.
Have you experimented with yourself on that versus just pigging out after a show versus a slow refeed?
Oh yeah, I have books kind of like this of like data of my stuff. And I think the most because I can eat, I love to eat, guys. I can put some food down. And my worst rebound ever, I got down to 165. Okay, that was on weigh-in day on Thursday. I was on stage at about 174, 24 hours later. And then 2 days later, I was 205.
74. So what do we got there? 26. So you got 31 pounds in 2 days.
and yeah, I ate a lot. I think I actually logged in. It's the most I've ever eaten in a day. I ate. I almost got to 13,000 calories, 12,997 calories of food. And I mean, it was just a huge, and that was my biggest day, but I had some 6, 7, 8,000 calorie days as well. And this was kind of leading to like the week, but yeah, I mean, let me tell you, I had a fat overshoot very quick. It was ugly to the point where, people say, it's like, how many years ago was that show? And then I'll tell them that was like last week.
Oh my God, that's too fun. Now, does it, as you get older, does it get harder to lose that fat because you've gone through these multiple cycles?
Yeah, well, now I try to be a little more careful. I mean, and I learned from that because I mean it's extremely uncomfortable. I mean, it is dangerous, of course. I mean, you're not gaining fat all at once. You're gaining a ton of water weight. I mean, you get pitting edema in your ankles. You can't breathe. I mean, it's your blood pressure's through the roof. I mean, it's uncomfortable. I mean, and you can get some rhabdomyolysis really bad. You can get. I mean, it can get very, very crazy. So. It's definitely not recommended. It's a health hazard. So this is why I think it's important. Lane Norton came out with this many years ago. It's like, hey, you can really go through a little bit slower, being more methodical. But I think it got to the point where it was a little bit too much, like a little bit too slow, right? So, what I've learned over the years, my approach is, yes, we don't want to go from, being in a hypocaloric state for weeks and weeks, and then all of a sudden, boom, now you're eating 8,000 calories, without paying attention to anything. There's a happy medium there. I also don't like to being in a deficit for so long and then, staying in a deficit for a long period of time. So some people kind of stay in a deficit for a longer period. So I really kind of like to get up to about maintenance calories, but you have to kind of figure out where maintenance is, because obviously, typically after a show, you're going to maybe not do as much cardio. You might be doing, your training volume is going to decrease overall, maybe your training intensity. So you have to take that into account. I'm not burning, 1,000, 1,500 calories a day on physical activity anymore. So you have to take that into account and figure out what that maintenance is. But nonetheless, get to that maintenance. So my approach is typically, hey, after you compete, have one meal, untracked, whatever you want. Maybe the next morning have one meal, and then that's it. After that, you have to kind of go back on a plan. And that plan should be somewhat more methodical, where you're trying to find that maintenance. And then you can kind of go through. And I actually like to go overeat for the night, overeat for the morning. And then I actually like to go on a slight deficit for maybe 2 or 3 days, then try to bring you up to maintenance for about a week. And then slowly go up from maintenance. Some people kind of take a long time to get to the maintenance or above the maintenance. And then I think, but it just prolongs your recovery after a show. And you see some of the data in some of the natural bodybuilders. There's been some case studies, and you actually see, how long it takes for them to get their thyroid back, to get their testosterone back, their sex hormone binding globulin to a normal level. All of those things kind of take a long time if you don't feed yourself fast enough. So to me, there's no sense in prolonging it. I say, get out of the deficit as quickly as you can without and just kind of teeter your training accordingly, monitor it and adjust it so that you're at that balance within there.
So what you're saying is, don't eat like Michael Phelps after you compete.
Exactly right. Exactly right.
Now, we don't want to keep you over time. I mean, we want to be respectful of all the time you're giving us. So I want to cover 2 things real quickly and have your comment, and Tony, you chime in as well. Your thoughts on T boosters, because I know Tony and I have talked about the various T boosters that are being promoted online, and also different forms of creatine.
Yeah, absolutely. So the T boosters, this is pretty crazy. Look, it's like this was like 10 years ago, it was a $2 billion industry. And I think it's just higher, so now it's even higher in the last few years. And, you have things like the traditional tribulus, you have the fenugreeks, you have the zinc, the maca, the ashwagandha, and then you have the tonkat alley. So you have a bunch of these different types. Recent meta-analysis just kind of shows that, okay, they looked at all of these different supplements there that are used, but they have a few caveats. So one they say is like, well, first of all, there's not enough evidence that any of them really work in large part. And then a couple of them don't even have like an established like mechanism of action, which to me is kind of like fundamental, right? Like, okay, well, if it does this, like, how does it do that physiologically? Show me the pathway in which it creates this increase in testosterone, or maybe increases your free testosterone. And a lot of them don't even have that mechanistic component there. in when you actually read the literature. But the other things that we actually see as well is a lot of them have multi-ingredients, so it's hard to kind of put it on one ingredient. The meta-analysis specifically said there's anywhere from like 8 to up to 50 ingredients in there. So 50? You really can't 50. So you really can't say it's just fenugreek or it's just the tribulus, because you have all these other things that are working in there. And of course, you never know with these supplements because they're not necessarily tested. So is it really just those ingredients, or did they put maybe an anabolic prohormone in there before, right, that maybe does increase it because it's a prohormone, or maybe an actual even, I read one study a while back where some supplements were laced with like small dosages of Dianabol. It's like, yeah, I'm getting jacked at all this. It's like, well, yeah, you're taking Dianabol.
I think Dianabol is pretty cheap, so that would make sense too. I think it would go back to cost effectiveness, but that would be effective.
Yeah. So when you see it, I really just see, it's I just look at it with caution. The other thing is the toxicity of some of these have not been really studied, so we don't know what some of the potential side effects are. And some of them do have these side effects without any of the real benefits. So you're basically getting side effects of doing like anabolic steroids without the same benefit. And so to me, it's like, if you're going to do it, might as well just, try to take the real thing. If you're going to,
I'm real hesitant at ever giving someone advice on taking these herbs, because I think you hit the nail on the head that mechanistically, it's like, you ask the same questions, like, well, okay, let's say it does what it does, but how does it do it? And there's no mechanism of action. And I think that's what's really problematic for me. It's like, I tell people, hey, if you want to try it. But, it seems like these things they have a life cycle. They show up and they become real popular. Then they disappear. Yeah. And then someone else promotes it. And it's like, holy crap. Now I'm getting questions about the same stuff, that I was getting 10 years ago. Who knows? Someone might start asking me about, ferulic acid or something. I don't know if you remember ferulic acid. Or no, my favorite. Did you ever try Smilax?
Oh yeah, Smilax. I remember that.
It was like sublingual or.
Yes. I even bought it when I like 20 some years ago.
Yeah, it's like we try all this stuff.
It's like I'm gonna get ripped. Just watch.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's funny how this stuff just sort of comes full circle. Your thoughts on the different forms of creatine?
Yeah, so we did a really cool study, a little different approach to some of them, but we went on Amazon.com and we were interested in seeing, it's like, hey, like how many alternative forms of creatine are sold on Amazon.com? So we did a search. We literally just went on Amazon on a particular date, and then we just put creatine and just saw all the products that came out. That were just called themselves creatine. And then we actually found, I took a few notes, 175 different creatine supplements, 16 different forms of creatine were actually in there. So, we have like your creatine ethyl ester, we have the creatine serum, we have the creatine nitrate, creatine citrate, all different sorts of, my favorite brand I have to remember was called Creatine. And the way that they marketed themselves and differentiate was because they have 10 forms of creatine, making it the most effective, right?
Creatine. God forbid it was creatinine.
Yeah. So it was, really we did an analysis of what's the cost per gram. And then of course the cost per gram for creatine monohydrate supplements is like 12 cents per gram, whereas for the alternative forms of creatine, it's about 26 cents per gram. So, and the evidence, kind of shows, when you look through it is creatine monohydrate still the gold standard. There's really not going to be, currently, there's no evidence showing that anything else is better than the creatine monohydrate. And that being said, I always kind of put an asterisk next to that. So just because something is not better than today doesn't mean that there's not something that's going to be better than at some point in time, right? So I think it's still, because creatine still has some limitations. We're looking at some of the brain research now, and we see, okay, it doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier as well as certain other things, or not as certain other things, but as well at the levels of creatine content in the brain aren't quite as high. when you take creatine monohydrate. You see a lot of non-responders in that. So are there other potential forms that may do it? Maybe, maybe not. Right now, I always kind of leave an open statement, kind of that scientific lens of, just because that's it today doesn't mean that that's going to be it forever. We have to keep an open mind and keep investigating further to see what things show. But ultimately, that's kind of what we found. Most of them had very limited evidence in terms of there was just either very few publications or no publications on scientific publications on these particular forms. And again, I kind of just earmark that again, where again, it doesn't mean that it doesn't work. It just means we need to look further and see if there's other potential forms that maybe at some point will work. One that's interesting to me is the guanidino acetic acid, which is the creatine precursor. And Dr. Osijek has been doing a lot of work in that for the last few years. And there's actually some pretty cool evidence to show that, hey, there's some promise there. And particularly when it comes to the brain creatine with that. But there's a lot of toxicity stuff that kind of needs to be, hammered out before that. And there are some products that are coming out with that. Of course, it takes a little longer to raise muscle or blood creatine content because it's got to convert it in the body. It's got to get methylated, so it's a little bit different rather than the creatine monohydrate. So yeah, that one's actually pretty interesting. And I read another interesting study on creatine nitrate plus creatinine. And Dr. Osijek actually did this study too.
Wait, you said creatine nitrate plus
creatinine? Yeah. So the study it had a creatine nitrate group. It had a creatine nitrate plus creatinine group. And then I can't remember if it had placebo or a creatine group. I can't remember what the third group was, but they actually compared the effects of this stuff, and they actually wrote a little paragraph. They don't understand the mechanism, but they actually hypothesized that creatinine can potentially turn back to creatine. It's not necessarily a waste product per se. So the article is actually pretty intriguing. It just came out a couple years ago, and it actually had similar effects to the creatine monohydrate group, I believe. So that was a pretty interesting study.
Yeah, that's not one I would have ever thought of. And the brain stuff is fascinating. It really is.
It really is.
And I think maybe we need higher doses for, getting it into the brain, perhaps.
Yeah, and that's kind of why the guanidino acetic acid in brain creatine is quite unique, because it needs to cross the blood-brain barrier, but the brain can obviously produce its own creatine, but maybe it could use the guanidino acetic acid, and that can cross the blood-brain barrier, and then it methylates maybe in the brain. I mean, I'm just throwing hypotheses out there. I don't know, but these are all potential things that I think, hey, there could be something there, to see where it goes. There was one study that actually did see that GAA was actually better than creatine monohydrate at crossing the blood-brain barrier. So that was pretty interesting. But that's only one study. I always say, hey, just because it's one study doesn't mean that it's one study. We got to take it. It's all a piece of the puzzle, right? We got to
exactly.
Same thing. Even when one study is negative, doesn't mean it doesn't work either. It's like it's just another piece of the puzzle. We got to look at it in different ways.
Absolutely, absolutely. Tony, you have any final comments before we let Dr. Escalante?
Well, no, just some really fascinating information. I think you touched upon a lot of things that we've been wondering, particularly in where we started, the potential causes of death in the bodybuilders. And I am very surprised that the expedited atherosclerosis and atherogenesis is occurring so quickly, but really good insight, very interesting. And it leads us to some of, maybe if nothing else, some of the ways we can behave, or practices bodybuilders can take to mitigate this, even in the presence of super physiological dosing, right? And I think that would be helpful, like looking at the lifestyle, a healthy lifestyle for the bodybuilder. Tough to achieve with all that training and high dosing, but maybe there are preventative measures that need to be considered while doing both, whether it's low intensity cardio for the heart itself or the left ventricle, who knows, but fantastic stuff. I found this really interesting.
Yeah, Guillermo, this is great. Definitely appreciate you coming on. It was a fascinating conversation. I love this stuff, and we could have talked forever, but gotta let you go. And I do want to make one crass commercial message to promote the ISSN conference. June 15 to 17, Fort Lauderdale Beach. It's right on the beach. So if you're listening to this, make sure you come to the ISSN conference. The three of us will be there. So otherwise, gentlemen, thank you and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks for
See
having
y'all
me.
soon.